Imagine this. You're standing on the edge of a cliff, but not the kind made of stone. This one is invisible, woven from choices you never realized you were making. Behind you, a voice urges safety, control, identity. Ahead, silence stretches into the unknown. You feel the pull in both directions. One path promises power, recognition, status. The other, something else, something wordless, strange, unnerving. You hesitate. You've followed the voice behind you your whole life. It sounds like you. It speaks in your language. It tells you who you are. It taught you to win, to strive, to be better, to never fall behind. It shaped your beliefs, your desires, even your sense of truth. But here, on this strange edge, a question begins to gnaw at you like a secret you were never supposed to hear. What if that voice isn't really you? What if the life you've built is a fortress protecting not your truth, but your illusion? What if the very self you've been defending through career, relationships, opinions, social media posts, spiritual masks, is just a beautifully crafted prison? What if you are not who you think you are, and never were? You look around and realize this war has no battlefield, no weapons you can touch, and yet it is the most brutal conflict you've ever lived through. It's not between countries or creeds. It is fought in the quiet moments when the noise dies down and something ancient tries to speak from beneath the noise. And the terrifying part is, it speaks a language you've forgotten how to understand. You feel it when you succeed, and still feel hollow. You hear it whisper when you're praised, but somehow feel like a fraud. You sense it in the late hours when the accolades lose their taste, and the mirrors show something cold and unfamiliar. Why does the version of yourself you show the world feel so disconnected from the one you carry in silence? Why does part of you always feel exiled, unseen, unheard? And who is exiling it? You've learned to call that exiled part irrational, weak, idealistic, even crazy. But what if that part is your soul and the you running the show is the usurper? What if the ego, so clever, so convincing, has become the dictator of your inner world? Pause here. Ask yourself truly, have I ever chosen who I am, or have I been performing who I was told to be? Most people never notice the war. They mistake their ego for their essence, their mask for their face, their cage for a temple. They build identities like armor, collecting titles, accolades, ideologies, routines, all in defense of an inner vacancy they dare not confront. They become performers in a play written by fear. But then sometimes a crack appears, a loss, a betrayal, a moment of silence so loud it breaks something, and through that fracture a different voice begins to rise. It doesn't shout, it doesn't argue, it just is. Timeless, unchanging, raw, and terrifying. Why terrifying? Because if that voice is real, then everything else might not be. You were taught to believe that growth meant adding more skills, more confidence, more certainty. But what if real growth is subtraction? What if it's about peeling away everything you've been told you need to be, until only the truth remains? And what if that truth is not convenient, not Instagrammable, not even comprehensible to the world around you? What if your entire life has been a brilliant defense against your own awakening? And here you are, standing on the edge. The ego clings behind you, frantic, persuasive, full of logic and pride. The soul waits ahead, silent, unknown, demanding surrender. Do you walk forward? Do you jump? Or do you turn back and pretend you never came this far? Before you decide, you must understand the war that brought you here. You must understand what the ego is, what the soul is, and why they are locked in battle inside you. Because only by seeing the battlefield clearly can you choose, consciously, who wins. And that begins with a single unsettling realization. You may not be who you think you are, and that changes everything. The ego didn't come out of nowhere. It was not born evil. It was born necessary, a survival strategy carved by fear, shaped by history, and sanctified by culture. From the moment you entered this world, helpless and wordless, your being collided with a society that demanded definition. Who are you? Wasn't a question. It was a command. And you obeyed. Piece by piece you constructed a mask, not out of vanity but out of hunger, to belong, to be safe, to be seen. The mask whispered, "If I'm smart enough, they'll love me. If I'm strong enough, I won't be hurt. If I'm successful enough, I'll finally matter." And so, brick by brick, the ego built a temple to protect a self that never felt whole. But here's the sickness no one tells you about. The ego can't love. It can only win. And in its hunger to win, it wages war against the only part of you capable of true freedom, your soul. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But before that, he warned of the shadow, the rejected, hidden self that lurks beneath your conscious identity. The ego fears this shadow, it fears the unknown, and in its fear, it fractures you from within. You become a performance, a curated identity that serves survival, not truth. You begin to feel this fracture as inner tension, the guilt that follows triumph, the emptiness inside accomplishment, the dissonance between who you are in public and what you cry over in secret. These aren't flaws. These are symptoms, psychic messages from a soul being buried alive beneath personas and projections. Friedrich Nietzsche warned of this slow death of the authentic self. He who fights with monsters, he said, should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. But what happens when the monster is inside you? When the ego, pretending to be your protector, becomes your jailer? The answer lies in the origin of the ego. It is not your enemy, it is your orphaned child. It was born when you were too young to understand pain, when a parent's coldness, a teacher's criticism, or a cruel remark broke something inside. Your ego stepped in. "I'll never let that happen again," it promised. "I'll control everything." And it tried. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that suffering, not joy, is the root of all existence. In his bleak vision of the human condition, we are driven by endless desire, forever chasing what vanishes the moment we grasp it. The ego, like a loyal addict, believes fulfillment lies in the next achievement, the next lover, the next dollar, the next victory. But each one leaves us emptier, hungrier, more afraid of stillness. This is no accident. Society feeds your ego while starving your soul. Your culture doesn't reward stillness or surrender. It exalts performance, control, image. Children are praised not for their essence, but for their output. Adults are measured by metrics that ignore meaning and the soul. It speaks in symbols, not spreadsheets. It weeps in silence, not status updates. It is illiterate in the language of ego. But here's the cruel paradox. The more you obey your ego, the more disconnected you become. You begin to feel it in ways you can't explain. A career that looks perfect on paper but feels like a cage. A relationship built on surface harmony, yet void of intimacy. A life that looks like someone else's dream. Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith, the act of lying to oneself to escape the anxiety of freedom. Because freedom, real freedom, is terrifying. It demands you confront not just who you are, but who you are not. Aldous Huxley understood this when he explored the spiritual sterility of modern life in Brave New World. He foresaw a society addicted not to fear, but a comfort. In such a world, the ego thrives. It sells you distraction as peace. It trades depth for dopamine. It confuses knowing more with being more. The soul, meanwhile, sits quietly beneath the noise, like a prisoner tapping on the walls of its cell, hoping you might one day listen. But why don't you? Why does the soul scare you more than the ego's illusions? Because to hear the soul is to hear your pain. It is to feel the grief of all the years you abandoned yourself to be accepted. It is to face the choices you made from fear, the dreams you betrayed, the voice you silenced. It is to admit, I don't know who I am anymore. And yet, in that grief lies your liberation. Viktor Frankl, who survived the horror of Nazi concentration camps, wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." But which self? The ego who adapts to survive, or the soul who dies for truth? This is the hidden problem. You have been taught to fear the very part of you that could save you. You have been conditioned to armor your ego and exile your soul. And as a result, you are living half a life, a mirror with no reflection, a voice with no source, a success with no peace. This war is not abstract. It is not poetic metaphor. It is a living tension in your chest, a quiet panic under your victories, a longing for something you cannot name. It is the war between control and surrender, between image and essence, between you. And now, perhaps for the first time, you are beginning to see it. But the consequences of not seeing it earlier, the way this war has shaped your choices, your beliefs, even your reality, are far deeper than you imagine, and they are coming into view. You wake up one morning and everything looks the same, but something is wrong. The coffee tastes the same. The sunlight still spills through the blinds. Your routine continues like a well-oiled machine, but underneath there's a quiet ache, like a violin string stretched too tightly across a hollow body. You ignore it. You always do. And that's the point. The war between your ego and your soul doesn't erupt like a revolution. It seeps slowly, silently. It disguises itself in habits, goals, and personas. It infiltrates the architecture of your life until you can no longer tell which parts were born from truth and which were born from fear. And you don't see the damage, not right away, but it's there. The first consequence is emotional distortion. You start feeling what you're supposed to feel instead of what you actually feel. You smile when you're breaking inside. You stay silent when your truth is roaring. You chase achievements not because they fulfill you, but because they distract you from the emptiness. Over time, you forget how to listen to yourself. You become fluent in performance and illiterate in authenticity. And then comes identity confusion. The ego, needing validation to survive, fragments you into roles. The strong one, the funny one, the successful one, the spiritual one. But none of these roles are real. They are costumes, archetypes worn to manipulate the perception of others and to hide from the perception of yourself. Eventually, you lose the thread of who you truly are. You forget what your soul sounded like before the world told you who to be. Cognitive dissonance sets in, like static between two radio stations, both broadcasting at once. One station screams, "Be more, do more, win more." The other whispers, "Come home." Let go, rest, but you can't listen to both. And because the ego is louder, you tune out the whisper. But something in you knows the static is not going away. It will only grow louder. Let's talk about decision-making. You think you're in control. You think you're making rational choices based on values and goals. But neuroscience reveals a harsher truth. Most of your decisions are driven by unconscious patterns. Emotional biases wired into the brain, reinforced by trauma, culture, and repetition. You are not choosing from freedom. You are reacting from fear. And fear is the ego's currency. The soul does not deal in fear. It speaks in intuition, resonance, subtle knowing. But you've learned to mistrust these. Why? Because they can't be measured, can't be monetized, can't be marketed. So you follow logic, strategy, consensus, and slowly the compass of your inner world stops spinning. You move through life with a dead needle. Now look around you. What happens when millions live like this? What happens when entire societies are led not by soul, but by collective ego? The result is a culture obsessed with surfaces and starving for depth. We have become a species addicted to distraction, plagued by loneliness and confused about meaning. We measure our worth in followers, our time in dollars, our minds in data. The ego's empire is built on noise, and that noise has consequences: depression, anxiety, chronic dissatisfaction. These aren't random pathologies. They're the psychic symptoms of a species at war with its essence. We medicate what we refuse to face. We numb the call of the soul with substances, screens, and status. We fill the silence with content, terrified of what we might hear if it grew quiet enough. You begin to feel it in your relationships. When two egos meet, they don't connect. They collide. They negotiate, posture, compete. They project old wounds onto each other and call it love. Vulnerability becomes weakness. Honesty becomes risk. Intimacy becomes rare. The soul craves communion, but the ego only knows transaction. Even spirituality has been hijacked. The ego wears enlightenment like another costume, posting meditative selfies, branding sacred practices, using spiritual language to reinforce its identity. I am awakened, it proclaims, while secretly fearing the death that awakening would require. Because that's the real terror of the soul. It demands the ego die. Not physically, not violently, but structurally. The ego must lose its throne. It must surrender its illusion of control. It must allow the unknown to enter and reshape everything. But the ego fears the unknown more than death, and so it fights. It builds stronger defenses, sophisticated rationalizations, spiritual bypassing, even moral superiority. It will do anything to stay alive. So the war continues, quiet but brutal, and you carry the wounds in places no one can see. You work harder, love harder, try harder, and wonder why it never feels like enough. You reach a goal and immediately set another. You lie awake at night, scrolling through the curated lives of others, wondering why you feel so lost. But what if you're not lost? What if you're just misled? What if your soul has been calling you all along, not with shouts, but with symptoms, the sadness, the boredom, the longing, the sense that something is off? These aren't flaws, they are signals. They are spiritual intelligence translated through emotion. The soul doesn't speak in English, it speaks in ache. But you've learned to silence ache, to label it mental health, to treat it like a bug, not a message. So the ache grows, it infiltrates the body, tension, fatigue, autoimmune conditions. It haunts the mind, looping thoughts, existential dread. a sense that time is slipping through your fingers and you're not really here. And it taints the future, because if your present is built on ego, your future is built on sand. Here's the deepest consequence of all. You may succeed in the world and still fail yourself. You may win the game and lose your soul. And the terrifying part, no one will stop you. The world will applaud you. They will cheer your ego's victories. They will call you inspiring, successful, influential. They will never ask about the cost. They will never know the quiet burial happening inside you, moment by moment, masked by applause. Unless you stop, you turn inward. You begin to question everything the ego promised and everything it feared. You begin to feel the pull again, that cliff edge, that silence, that strange sense that another way exists. If only you have the courage to dismantle everything you thought you were. But how do you rebel against something you've been taught to worship? How do you surrender without losing yourself completely? To find out, you must enter the rebellion, and that begins now. You don't escape a war by making peace with your captor. You escape by rebellion, and not the loud, angry rebellion of protests and manifestos, but the silent, sacred rebellion of turning inward, of choosing truth over image, depth over ease, soul over ego. Here's what they don't tell you. To rebel against the ego is to dismantle your entire way of being. It is to unlearn the story you were told about yourself. It is to die symbolically so you can finally live. Most people won't do this, not because they can't, but because the illusion feels safer than the truth, even if the illusion is killing them. So what does this rebellion look like? It starts with noticing. You begin to observe the voice of your ego, not as you, but as a character. You hear it say, "You'll never be good enough." And instead of obeying, you pause. You hear it scream, "They need to respect you." And you ask, who is they? And why do I need their approval? This is radical. It's the moment you shift from being the voice to being the one listening. This is where freedom begins. Viktor Frankl once said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response." That space is where the rebellion happens, not in grand gestures, but in micro movements of self-awareness. The ego reacts, the soul responds. Now here's the next phase, disidentification. This means stepping back from every label you've ever used to define yourself. I am successful. I am spiritual. I am broken. I am the strong one. All of it. Why? Because these identities are often armor. They are not who you are. They are who you had to become. Jean-Paul Sartre warned of this when he spoke of existential authenticity. He said that most people live in bad faith, meaning they conform to roles to avoid the anxiety of freedom. But freedom is not found in fixed identities. It is found in the terrifying realization that you are not any of the things you pretend to be. This can feel like death, and it is. But only to the ego, to the soul, it is rebirth. Now you begin to listen differently. You stop asking, "Hey, what should I do to win?" You start asking, "What is true, even if it costs me?" You stop performing. You start feeling. You stop chasing certainty. You begin walking into the unknown. And here's where the paradox deepens. The more you let go of control, the more you gain clarity. The more you surrender, the more you discover power, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that liberates. Take meditation not as a spiritual trend, but as a rebellion. Why? Because it is the act of doing nothing in a world addicted to doing everything. It is the ego's nightmare: silence, stillness, non-productivity. But in that silence, you begin to hear the voice beneath the noise. Or journaling, not to curate content, but to confront your truth. You write without filters, without an audience. You let the soul speak in messy, painful honesty. It tells you things you don't want to know, but need to hear. And sometimes the rebellion is even more radical. You leave the job that made you feel dead inside. You walk away from a relationship built on performance, not presence. You disappoint others to honor your own integrity. You say, "I don't know who I am, but I will no longer pretend." This is the path of the soul. Lonely at first, but eventually luminous. Historical rebels knew this. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, left his palace, wealth and status, not to reject the world, but to discover the truth of suffering. Jesus retreated into the desert for 40 days, not to build a brand, but to silence the ego's temptations. Socrates drank poison rather than betray his inner voice. Teresa of Avila faced religious persecution to remain faithful to her ecstatic inner visions. These were not acts of conformity, they were acts of spiritual revolution. You may not be called to such extremes, but you will be called to risk. Risk being misunderstood, risk being alone, risk looking foolish in a world that equates noise with value. Because here's the truth. The ego cannot be negotiated with, it must be overthrown, but not through violence, through truth. Relentless, uncomfortable, liberating truth. And what happens when you commit to this rebellion? At first, things fall apart. The mask begins to crumble. You lose people who are attached to your persona. You lose opportunities built on performance. You even lose your sense of certainty. But beneath the loss, you begin to feel something ancient stirring, stillness, presence, real joy. Not the dopamine spike of ego validation, but the deep contentment of soul alignment. You begin to create, not to prove your worth, but to express your essence. You begin to love, not from need or transaction, but from presence. You begin to live not as a brand, but as a being. And the strangest thing happens. You become more powerful than ever. Not because you control more, but because you are no longer controlled. Not by fear, not by roles, not by the illusion of perfection. You become the observer, the still point in a spinning world, the presence beneath performance, the soul behind the mask. And slowly, life begins to shift around you. You attract different people, those who see your essence, not your act. You take different risks, not for gain, but for growth. You experience beauty differently, not as escape, but as communion. You realize you were never broken, you were buried, and the rebellion wasn't against the world. It was against forgetting who you are. So now the question remains. You've pulled off the mask. You've stood at the edge. You've felt the spark of something sacred. But can you walk all the way through? Can you let the ego die so the soul can finally breathe? The final realization awaits, the one that makes sense of every ache, every fracture, every war you've ever fought. And it is coming now, in the final truth that will change everything. There's a moment, quiet, unglamorous, almost imperceptible, when you realize the war was never between two enemies. It was between two illusions. The ego was never evil. It was never the enemy. It was a frightened child trying to survive in a world that taught it love must be earned. And the soul, it was never absent. It was never silent. It was patient, waiting for you to stop mistaking noise for music. You were the battleground, but you were also the peacemaker. And here, in this final moment of stillness, you see it clearly. There is nothing to conquer. There is only something to remember. Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff, not the one your ego feared, but the one your soul built. Beneath you, not a void, but a vast ocean of presence. You don't have to jump. You only have to let go. And in that letting go, something astonishing happens. You don't fall, you rise, because the soul was never beneath you. It was always within you, waiting to be embodied, not worshipped. The ego said, "Become more." The soul whispers, "Remember, you are already whole." This is the final paradox. The very thing you've been searching for, peace, love, purpose, was never outside you. You wore it, you breathed it, you buried it beneath identities, ambitions, traumas, personas. And now, like waking from a long fever, you remember, you are not your success. You are not your failure. You are not your story. You are not your mask. You are the one beneath the story, the one watching, the one breathing, the one being. And in this revelation, the war ends, not with a bang, but with a deep exhale. The ego isn't banished, it's reintegrated, not as the master, but as the servant. You see, the ego was a tool, like fire, dangerous when left unchecked, powerful when guided by soul. And now, you guide it. Now you live differently. You speak not to be heard, but to connect. You create not to impress, but to reveal. You walk through life not as a brand, but as a presence. You no longer fear being misunderstood, because your truth no longer requires approval to exist. And the past, the pain, the performance, the wars you fought to be someone, they no longer haunt you. They humbled you. They taught you what nothing else could. That the truth will set you free. But first, it will dismantle everything you thought you were. And so, you thank the war. You thank the ego for protecting you when you didn't yet know your own power. You thank the soul for waiting through every detour, every disguise. And you thank yourself for having the courage to look inward when the world begged you to stay asleep. This is the ultimate truth. You were never broken. You were only buried beneath layers of conditioning, comparison, conformity, beneath the screams of not enough and try harder, beneath the hollow applause of a world that profits from your doubt. But you are not here to be a product. You are here to be a presence. You are not here to perform. You are here to remember. And what you remember is this: you are the soul, and the soul is free. It always was. So now you walk differently. You move through rooms not trying to win them, but to bless them. You listen not to respond, but to receive. You love not to possess, but to witness. You serve not to be seen, but to express your essence. This isn't martyrdom, it's mastery. It's not about becoming holy, it's about becoming whole. And now you see the world differently too. You see people not as competition, but as fellow souls, each waging their own quiet war. You meet their egos with compassion because you remember what it was like to be lost in the mask. You meet their pain with presence because you know how long it takes to feel safe enough to feel. You no longer need to be above anyone. You only need to be with them. That is the power the ego could never understand. Love without possession, freedom without control, being without performing. And here's the final whisper: the truth beneath all truths. There was never a war. There was only forgetting and remembering. And now that you remember, you return. Not as a warrior, not as a winner, not as an enlightened being. You return as yourself, which finally is enough.